Okay, I want to officially welcome everyone to the Agile Procurement and Contracting Symposium brought to you by the Business Agility Institute. My name is Shannon Ewan. I'm with the International Consortium for Agile. We're one of the founding members of the Business Agility Institute, and I'm actually standing in today for Evan Laybourne, who is flying somewhere in the world as we speak, so unable to join us today. But he's very excited to watch the video. We've got a great slate of speakers today and a very full program, as you can see. So we're going to jump right in here in a minute. It's going to be six 15-minute talks, followed by a 20 to 30-minute question and answer segment. Like I said, we're not going to do questions after each speaker. We are going to batch them and go through them at the end. So you are welcome to put your questions into the chat window as we progress, and we will take questions essentially on a first come, first served basis for the end portion. And I think that's all of the preamble. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, who is Dean Leffingwell, creator of the Scaled Agile Framework and chief methodologist at Scaled Agile Incorporated. Dean, please take it away.
Thanks. Here. Good. Thanks, Shannon, for having us, and welcome to our little conflab on Agile Contracts. I think as an attendee, you're going to see 5 or 6 perspectives on Agile Contracts in a very short period. I'm attending in part to see what other people have to say about Agile Contracts, because I think when you compare it to the not Agile Contracts, we all are in a bit of a bind and a bit of a dilemma. I think we understand now that the digital transformation affects everybody. I was visiting a shipbuilder a few weeks ago, and I thought they were going to talk about their prowess in Agile IT, and it was all about working on the ship using augmented reality, et cetera, to be able to help people weld the ship. So the disruption is universal. Every business is a software business now, and the good news is we have some paths now. I think the lean Agile enterprise, the ability to combine the prowess of Agile teams and lean thinking at the higher levels of program and portfolio gives us a set of solutions that we can work with. Now, as I was preparing for this talk, I was actually working primarily in kind of the government context, but just recently, last week, as a matter of fact, I had a full week roadshow to India. And it really flavored my presentation here because this is a big challenge in that market. We talked to captive shops and outsourcing shops, all who had the same problem, which is that we can certainly be Agile. We're not crazy here. We'd like to be as Agile as we can be. We understand the power of Agile at the team level, at the program level, and even at the portfolio level, but we don't always have permission. And when we do have permission, we're still not sure exactly what that means. Are there specs? No specs? Do you want an estimate? No estimate? Time and materials? How are you working? How are we working? What are we handing off? Specs, features, stories? I saw contracting by story point, which is pretty scary. I think you can imagine the ramifications of that. How do you get feedback? Certainly contested awards, meaning that when we bid a project, especially in the US federal government space, high probability somebody else is going to say, I don't think that award was awarded right. So now how do you think about a contested award when you don't know what the price of the contract is? So these are serious issues, and frankly, they affect our ability to proceed in an Agile way. And we're moving from an environment where we thought we knew how to contract, which was these are our legacy contract models reflecting the iron triangle, where, hey, if you could tell me what the requirements are, I could predict the cost and give you a schedule. But those are just estimates, right? Well, it's not necessarily suitable that be an estimate because I'm on the procurement side and I need to know, is this $3 million or $4 million? Is it $30 million or $50 million? So we've been operating in this environment, somewhat successfully for, at least 30 or 40 years. But the reality is it doesn't free us from the constraints because maybe those aren't the right requirements. And if they're not the right requirements, then what do I do with the cost and schedule? So the iron triangle is not a good place to operate from. And in reality, the full range of Agile contracts types doesn't really help either. On the left, firm fixed price. On all the way over to the right is the pure time and materials. Neither of those are particularly rewarding. Neither of them, if you look about firm fixed price, that actually sets the supplier and the customer at odds. Immediately, their economic goals are different. From a supplier standpoint, it's a fixed price. I need to provide as little as possible to still get paid. And from a contractor standpoint, I need to get as much as possible for the minimum amount of money. And I don't think it's a good thing when we generally enter contracts with different economic principles. Way on the right, time and materials. Well, in a way, that's certainly more agile. And we do see a lot of that. I certainly wouldn't rule that one out. But when are you done? How do you know? How do you measure value? What prevents the supplier from just saying, well, the longer this program goes, the better? Or maybe in a government agency where they're saying funding the project is the goal rather than really delivering value. So I don't think either end of I don't think the iron triangle or even the spectrum really solves our problem. So we need a new approach. And we need an approach that optimizes the economic value for both parties, short and long term. We need adaptive responses to requirements. We can't just sit behind a spec and say, this is what you ordered, this is what you're getting, when it isn't the right thing. It belies Agile from the get-go. We can and should provide continuous visibility, objective evidence, and I think this is where we really have a breakthrough. Our Agile iterative and incremental model gave us a new tool called this is the system, and it's working or it isn't, versus this is where we are and the requirements burned down, or this is where we are approaching system integration. And we need to provide a measured approach, because what we've discovered at the portfolio level particularly is that investing in a large initiative, an EPIC, is an investment that pays off initially very low, even with incremental development. I don't have enough value to be able to really hit the earned value chart. After that, it gets really, really good. But then after that, it's diminishing returns. So we may well discover that investing less than we thought gets the right economic value. How do I do that without a contract that supports that? And we also need to offer the supplier some confidence, because if it's a pure T&M thing and it can be cut off any minute, who could really assign their people to that? I mean, they have opportunity costs. They have lost opportunity associated with the other bids they didn't do. And frankly, a model that motivates all parties to build the best possible solution within the economic boundaries. And I'm going to highlight very briefly kind of a lightning talk. One approach that we're seeing in use in a couple places, just as a suggested approach, and it's different than I think you've probably seen before, and I won't be able to cover it in much detail. On the other hand, I will cover it at a high level, and we'll make the slides available so that you can find your way to this content at whatever point suits your interest. I call this a scaled agile managed investment contract because I couldn't think of anything clever. And why is it scaled? Because that's where the materiality is. It's when you're bringing 50 or 100 or 500 people to bear on a new initiative for a customer, the project gets really interesting, because that's when the overruns are not 10 or 20,000, or where the bids are not 10 or 20,000, they're 10 or 20 or 30 million. And in some cases, 10 times that amount, certainly in certain environments. So let's take a look at what this could be structured at. The first thing is an interesting challenge and opportunity, which is we know how we do our work now. We work in the context of agile teams. It's and team sprint. And for most of us, we know what that sprint length is. And even if we didn't necessarily all have the same sprint length, certainly in the context of a potential contract, we could establish that. We know the team is probably less than 10 individuals. We know that they're cross-functional self-organizing, and they can define, build, and test value. And we have a notion now that says, well, wait a minute, we could just hire one team or two teams for a sprint. And because they're going to deliver value every 2 weeks, and that's going to be objective evidence, this is the root of a potential new approach to Agile contracts. And then how would we price it? Look, it's going to be X dollars per feature team sprint. Can't explain that in any depth, but I think you get the idea. This team or this set of teams can build features, and they do that every sprint. And we could talk about organizing that way. And then as we approach the contract boundaries, we have some rules and responsibilities that we need to discuss. We need to understand, I'll call this PI1 program increment. That's a safe term. It's a big set of sprints. It's 2, 3, 4, 5 sprints, whatever makes sense for you. How we're going to ramp up and ramp down when the time comes. What our responsibilities are. How many are we going to need for the initial PI? And then is it going to ramp up or down from there based upon the scope of our discovery? We have to understand the vision and roadmap. I probably don't have specs, but I certainly have to have an understanding of what we're trying to build. And a view that says we'll plan one sprint and that's good enough isn't good enough. We have to know more than that. And we have to have the ability to then commit to PI1 with some small number of folks. And the responsibilities are definitely different. There are no models of agile development, successful agile development, that decouple the customer from the supplier or the people that build it. So the customer has to be available and committed to be a participant in the program. This is really their program, not ours. On the right, we certainly know what we need to commit to, and in the set is the largest, in the center is the largest set of shared responsibilities, and they include vision and roadmap and what we describe as fixed and variable solution intent and other elements of the economic framework. If we could agree that we want to employ teams, not individuals at a specific billing rate, and if we could agree on these responsibilities, we could talk about, let's just take this one PI at a time, or whatever increment you define. Rarely is that simply a sprint, although I've seen the cases in the federal government where a sprint really was the quantum. And we could start by executing, making a commitment to the first program increment. We can provision the teams and the roles. We can do planning. That's a joint planning effort. That's face-to-face. That's all of us working together to describe exactly what we're trying to do. We can execute that first PI, and then we've established our program scope and timeline. We've done a big spike through the system. Maybe we have some working software. Maybe we have a demo. Maybe we just have some estimating work that we've done and an architecture that we put a thread through. And we can update the vision and backlog. And now we're kind of good to go. We're ready to proceed because we've made it through this feasibility and scope area. So now the supplier has proven themselves to the customer. And by the way, in many cases, this might have to happen more than one time. If you're working in the DoD, you may have a couple of suppliers that you initiate this first PI with to establish the feasibility and scope and establish the visibility and the trust that would say, I think these folks get it. I think they can do what we need to do. And then we take it literally a PI at a time. We execute each PI. We measure the progress bi-weekly via the system demo. That's not optional. We're going to demo our work every 2 weeks. And that's not simply team demos. That's a team of teams working together to integrate that work. The system demo then is a major contract event, and that happens every 2 weeks. We can measure, evaluate, inspect, and adapt. And the solution demo is a really big deal. At that point, we all come together for the next PI and we evaluate the solution. And we decide then whether we want to increase, add teams. You can see here we've added an extra team or two. Take steady as she goes. Maybe pivot to a whole new, maybe keep the teams in place and pivot to a whole new direction, or potentially ramp down. And that gives us the option to treat things differently. As we start thinking about winding down and maintenance, we also start thinking about where our diminishing economic returns are. And as intelligent stakeholders, be we supplier or contractor, we're all obligated to make sure that the money is wisely spent. And the money is wisely spent based upon objective evidence of feedback. So we don't even want to necessarily commit to the entire scope of a program. We know that that is fraught with peril because that scope is going to change. Instead, we want to know what our wind down agreements are. And as we wind down, these solutions don't go away. We all know that. I mean, my guess is everybody on this conference, certainly the speakers, is involved in supporting systems that were developed 5 and 10 and even 15 years ago. We want to use the same execution model because we want to maybe add new functionality or go straight into maintenance or business as usual with the same teams. So rather than starting, small projects, we're going to think about doing this a value stream as possible. Doing a value stream at a time. And where possible, then we can keep the knowledge acquisition and the value flow together. And if you want to know a little bit more about this process, take a look at scaledagileparamework.com lean budgets, which along with an article called Agile Contracts, which is available at Advanced Topics, describes this in a little further detail. So I've reached the end of my 15-minute time box, and I'll tell you, 15 minutes goes by really fast. But given that, we're going to hold questions, and we're going to switch to the next speaker, and we're going to get another view of Agile Contracts.
All right, thank you very much, Dean, for that. And once again, those of you, please keep track of your questions along the way so that we can be sure to address them towards the end. And the good news for those of you who joined in progress, this video will be available along with all of the presentation slides as well. So if you missed the initial few minutes of Dean's talk, you will be able to to review the slides and the video at your convenience. And next up, joining us from Switzerland, we have Mirko Kleiner. He is the creator of Lean Agile Procurement at Flow Days, and he's going to be speaking on procurement on disruption. So I will hand the mic to you, Mirko. Oh, you're still muted. Let's see if we can.
Thank you, Shannon, and welcome you guys all over the world. It's a pleasure to talk with you about our new disruptive approach, Lean Agile Procurement, and I brought with me an application from the field, and it was funny to hear what Dean is predicting. We just did it. So I will have two topics in my talk, in my 15 minutes. Once I will tell you about a real case in the energy sector where we are unsure, but we believe we hit a new world record in sourcing a complex project. And second, we will give you a very brief introduction in Lean Agile Procurement that you just could connect the dots why we did it this way. So let's start how we do contracting today. And I reduce that to the RFP process. So the problem in software, but not only in software, in sourcing complex projects like professional services, software project, IT, could be organizational complexity, is that it makes no sense to describe a complex problem. Furthermore, we have a lot of handovers in the current process. And in the end, we then, if we have the contract, and if we are lucky we have already an agile contract, we are allowed to start working as a team, buyer plus the vendor as an agile team. And this needs a lot of time, and we call it, it's a bit provocative, but this is cost of delay. It does work fine for simple and complicated problem, because there you can describe everything, but please do not use it in a complex sourcing project. So we thought about how agile, oops, now my slides are frozen. So we believe we need a major upgrade because this process is already 120 years old. And we thought about, what if we have just one day to decide? And in Agile, we work as a team, as a cross-functional team, and not just the cross-functional team that the buyers out there are used to. This is the cross-functional team that will do the job. So that will have end-to-end responsibility also for developing the product, the service, etc. Beside that, we are still facing the problem with uncertainty, and we've learned from business development that they are facing the same problem, and they've solved that. Or are you still writing 100 pages business cases? You most probably won't. So they have a tool, they have a business model canvas or lean canvas, and we thought it would be awesome to have something similar for procurement. So we developed that more than 2 years ago, and we do not have the time to go into details, but basically it consists of three areas. In the middle, the why we need this project, why we need this initiative, why we need this vendor. On the right-hand side, the buyer section, who are our customers, what are their needs, and on the left side, the supplier section, what are their capabilities, product, services to resolve the customer needs. Now, give me a short overview how the approach Lean Agile Procurement works. So at the very beginning, we do have a business case that gives us a lot of information we just can overtake, and we have to work out some more parts of on the buyer side. We set up a cross-functional team, and this team basically goes similar what Dean said into a PI planning could be a sequenced series of workshops with the vendors, or it could be done in parallel, as you like, depends on the context, what is possible. And you basically just work out the whole canvas together. And then you decide, and you just start. And what we found out is the canvas is a beautiful summary just to continue working together and keep it up to date as you do for the business cases as a partner, beautiful partner management tool. You even can assess an existing partnership with the canvas within 1 hour, no problem. We start to use it also the other way around and send it offers towards buyers. So multiple possibilities to use it. So this is very lean as we do not lose so much time. And let me show you how we applied that in a real case. So this was an energy company here in Switzerland. They have around 2,000 employees, and they were looking for a new intranet solution provider, but also the product was not set yet. And I mean, sounds trivial, but they had 2,000 stakeholders. So there was an organizational complexity. And they were used to agile development already, but they thought it would be time now to also give a try on the procurement side. So how we started, the Lean Procurement Canvas was a beautiful instrument to guide us through. We started with the why. What is the vision of this? Why we need this intranet solution? What are the strategic goals we want to achieve? Who can support us? Who will be part of this cross-functional team? And what are the customers, the personas, the customer segments and their needs, etc. What we also did, what was very important, with the very first workshop, we empowered them so that they were able to decide. So it was important that, hey, stop. Now we can't invite the suppliers because these are all assumptions. So we need to validate that. On our timeline, we just invested 1 week because the team was not working 100% on that topic. They had something like 2 days a week. And we decided to invite representatives from each persona and make a preparation workshop to find out what are their real customer needs and their priority, etc. So we didn't create any shiny slides. We just brought our canvas. We brought everything else we worked out. And with approximately 50 people, we got within 4 hours a very clear picture what is really important to them and what are maybe just nice to haves. Yeah, then we just concluded all the results and we said, now, okay, now it's time to create the short list and then later on to invite three possible partners. But the invitation, we didn't provide them any details. We just gave them as less information as needed and as much information so that they knew what will be the approach, who has to show up, and what is the goal of this initiative. So during this, we've organized this 2 days workshop, and this 2 days workshop had 2 goals. One goal was to complete the Lean Procurement Canvas, which basically was just a summary of their offer. And that was mentioned as we need a formal offer. So as part of that, we also reviewed and updated a draft of the Agile Contract. Second goal was, as the developer were there as well, we asked them to show up with all the people so that they can decide. So similar to the PI planning. So there were salespeople there were legal people there were developers were there, decision takers were there, just everybody. And as the developers were there as well, and not just the most senior ones, but the ones that will do the job. And as they were there, the second goal was also to create some proof of concept. What we see here, this was the CFO. He was telling about the vision of the company and why they need this project, etc. So they got everything from first hands. We let them work out all the details we needed to create a formal offer. So they did the estimation in front of us. They they could ask at any time any details. We worked together. The timing, we didn't agree to, in the end, we didn't agree to the user stories because we said this will anyway change, but we agreed to some co-created goals and key results. And we even created together some metrics and KPIs, how we will measure if you're on track. After every bigger block, we did some presentation, and this was interesting because all the other vendors, there were 3 vendors in one room, got this information as well. The only thing we keep intransparent were the economics and the Agile contract. But beside that, we got a lot of feedback, and this was also interesting to see how they reacted, because we fostered kind of competition within these 2 days as well. Beside that, we also gave a lot of feedback. What is the current gut feeling? So, for example, we had a breakout session regarding the cooperation model, how we will work together, and then we gave feedback. Okay, you're great, so this is a 5, or well, we have to improve, we need to have another session or so. As I said, the second goal was to create a proof of concept. So at every day we had in the morning a short planning where they just pulled what they thought was possible to achieve till the evening. And in the evening, we had on each day a public review with the real users, which was very interesting. They saw exactly what they will get, what the application looks like. They could ask some questions, and the suppliers got direct feedback. So basically, with the help of the Lean Procurement Canvas, we just went through everything and got a nice summary for the Agile contract. And yes, what we found out, we are working together with lawyers as well, is the Lean Procurement Canvas is the most lean Agile contract beside a verbal contract. However, the corporates won't accept that. We had an attachment with a written Agile contract as well, but this was updated and discussed with both legals, the business guys, decision takers within 45 minutes, and they found an agreement. So let's come to the results. So the timing, we had very intensive 2 days, but in the whole lead time was about 5 weeks. The investment at the buyer side was around 2 FTEs, while on the supplier side, it was much less. The outcome was we had some fantastic results. So for time to market was comparing to a classic approach, similar complex project in the same company was 4 times faster. The customer involvement was much less than usual, but with a much higher quality of information. And also important for the suppliers, we got a decision on the second day. We got a sign-off of the contract on the same day, and we just started or continued working on the third day. So no delays on that. What are some conclusions? So in procurement, it's often a lot about savings. So because we had, we gave a lot of focus to what is really needed, we just had savings through not doing things. So we focus just to the very important things only. The collaboration, asking questions at any time, created a high alignment, but also commitment. We got in touch, personally in touch, and there was already a start of a social integration. Regarding the contracting, there was really a discussion how we deal with warranty, how we deal with risk, what happens if we are too late, how we deal with that. That was very, very good discussions on a same eye level. And understanding the customer, so focusing to the customer needs, leads to innovation. So we ask also the suppliers, what are your ideas, what other customers did, etc. Obviously, we also had some challenges. Uncertainty feels wrong. These procurement guys were not used to Agile, so we had to introduce them. The capacity of the people is always a challenge, but we're questioning the priority. Handling 3 vendors in one room in parallel is not that easy. I have to speed up, I just got the sign. The legal, please work with the legal, they have to become part of the story as well. Some good practices, just a summary, start with why, invest in Agile knowledge, insist in a management buy-in. This is all not new. Important is invest in a good supplier briefing and incorporate with the legal very early. My philosophy is let the team find their way. There is not just the way or the approach. So every implementation we've done so far was very different. So thank you very much. There is a community website where we share all the informations. The Lean Procurement Canvas is open source, and I'm keen on your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mirko, and perhaps we can delve into some of those concluding ideas once we get to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. And now we're going to move on to Stuart James. He's joining us from London. He is the Managing Director at AgileX, and the title of his talk is Why Lawyers Don't Like Agile.
Thank you, Shannon. Hopefully you can hear me. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. As Shannon says, I'm Stuart James. I'm a lawyer based in the UK, specialising in technology contracts. I've been a lawyer for over 20 years, including working both in the UK, USA, and in Australia. I first became involved with drafting contracts for Agile methodologies nearly 20 years ago, before the Agile Manifesto, when it was known in the software development world really as rapid application development. As a result of all that experience, I think that lawyers probably represent one of the biggest barriers to the use of Agile, probably something that Mirko might agree with. So that's quite an admission for a lawyer to make, I guess. So the purpose of this presentation, if I can get the slides to work, that's better, is to explain why I think that might be the case, why or what some of the myths are that lawyers tend to latch onto when they persuade their clients not to use Agile, and then to look at some of the commercial challenges that are faced by a lawyer when trying to draft a contract for Agile. My short presentation is going to be followed by Alan Kelly, who's going to take this discussion a little bit further by actually looking at the contents of Agile contracts. So without further ado, why is it that lawyers don't like Agile? Well, lawyers like certainty. They like to have a certain outcome. They like to have certainty of cost, of time, and a whole range of other certainties that they like to articulate and lay down in their contract. Lawyers are generally conservative by nature, and they're trained to, and as a result of their experiences in working with their customers, are very adept at identifying and dealing with risk, finding mitigations to deal with the risks that come up. And one of the things that they tend to do by nature is that they prefer to use precedent wherever possible. Examples of contracts that they've used in the past, or drafting of clauses that they've used in the past. The problem with this is it tends to create a reliance culture. Many lawyers, as a result, struggle to actually deal without having a precedent there to guide them. And as a result, tend to reuse what they know works. Now, that is great for predictability. It does mean you know precisely how a clause is going to be interpreted by a court, so it avoids litigation, certainly on behalf of clients suing their lawyers. But the other side of the coin is it also has the impact of it stifles innovation. So historically, if we look at how particularly software contracts have been developed in the past, in the early days of developing software, lawyers tended to look at what they knew best, which were the engineering and construction type templates that used very sequential processes that suit those sectors. It also suited the early days of software development, where organizations, where developers had to design and build from first principles software applications. And that's probably one of the main reasons why we talk about software engineering, why students go to courses that are about software engineering, because of those initial steps into development of the new technologies. However, we now operate in an environment where parties are seeking to digitize services, and the imperative is very much on a first to market approach. And that means that the traditional sequential contracts are no longer as appropriate. Now, I'm not an evangelist. Agile isn't for all contracts, and it's not suitable for all projects. However, the issues that you face with a sequential contract are typically that it tries to articulate all the required features up front, i.e. it front loads all the analysis work and locks in, as a result, the delivery of specific features, regardless of the relevance. And it may well be the case that by the time the solution is actually developed, some of those features or functions are no longer required, or not required in the same degree, or to the same degree as was first anticipated. The sequential process, therefore,
Stuart, I apologize for the interruption. We've had a request, if you're able to put your slides in the slideshow mode so that they should be larger.
I thought I had, beg your pardon.
No problem.
Does that help?
Thank you. Yep, that's perfect.
Okay. So yes, so I've lost my train of thought now. So yes, so the tendency is as a result that you end up with a very sort of siloed mentality to the delivery of the slide pack. Sorry, I've lost all the controls off my off my screen now. So just bear with me a sec. No, don't do that. Okay. Okay, well, I'll have to go on and hope that the slides will continue to move. So the result of that is that you tend to have an inflexibility of approach. Sorry, Shannon, are you controlling my slides now?
I was trying to subtly take the remote control to see if I could help with that frozen issue, but my apologies there. We'll give you a few seconds to resume, get back on the right train of thought.
Okay. What I was actually trying to do was minimize the screen a little bit so that I can see what I'm talking to. Okay, I got to carry on anyway. Right. Okay. So that has an. So the impact is that the parties are looking at a contract that ceases to reflect the actual needs of the parties going forward. And one of the keys of that is that having set out the terms of the contract in the initial stages, the parties then become very reluctant to change the terms of the contract going forward. There's actually a resistance to change in the way that contracts are drafted, because from a legal perspective, change means a change in the price, change in the outcome, and you lose some of those certainties. So the contract terms are actually drafted to try and prevent change going forward as the contract goes forward. The result of that is that you end up with a very sort of siloed mentality, with both parties fixed into boxes in a contract that is almost set in concrete, where the parties can't change, they can't develop, they can't react to new requirements or changes in the understanding of how features are required by the parties as the process goes through. The worst case scenario is, of course, that as a result of that, the customer doesn't actually get what they need. Their needs have evolved through the life of the contract, through their understanding of the contract, of the development of the solution, and because they aren't able to change as easily as they thought they were able to, they end up with a solution that doesn't actually match their requirements. If in the worst case scenario that gets to the point where they reject the solution, that tends to mean, from the supplier's perspective, that they lose in the scope of damages. Effectively, a lose-lose scenario for both parties. On top of that, you get a range of other issues that come into place. For example, the fact that the only way you can contract for Agile is to use a T&M type, time and materials type based of pricing. My experience with Agile is that actually you can use any commercial model that you could use with a sequential contract for Agile. The only limitation or boundaries within the parties is lack of imagination as to how the parties can pay for the various different elements. Agile contracts are often broken into different phases, with a discovery phase at the start, followed by incremental implementations at a later stage. Those different styles of phases can actually be broken up into different types of commercial models. We've already spoken about the uncertainty of the outcome, and that relates around to the scope and the vision for what the parties are trying to achieve by the contract. The reality is that although in an Agile contract you're not going to set down and articulate every level of requirement, the overall outcome of the project will be clear. So, for example, if you're intending to develop a CRM solution, you will still end up with a CRM solution at the end of the project. It's just that some of the features or the functionalities may have changed during the life of the contract. There's also a big need for cultural change between the parties. Agile is very collaborative, and that means that the end users, the individuals who are going to use the solution at the end of the day, need to be much more involved with its evolutionary development. For the customer, that often means, or the executive within the customer, that often means handing over a greater degree of control to more junior employees within that organization. And that that loss of control can be a bit scary at times, and is often restricted in traditional contractual models by limiting the scope to which more junior members of the team can actually be involved in taking decisions and being empowered to be involved in the project. So moving on to the challenges, I've already mentioned the fact that there needs to be agreement on scope, but the key issue here is that although the scope will be set out at a higher level, the key is the ability to change throughout the life of the contract. And that's achieved by allowing the parties to agree change through a flexible mechanism rather than the traditional restrictive mechanisms that tend to allow for large or lengthy periods of impact analysis that delay the process. There are two levels essentially of change within the contract. There are those that need very quick change processes that still need to understand and recognise the need to articulate those changes and record those changes, and those changes that impact at the higher level specification level, that require a greater deal of clarity and certainty and agreement between the parties. In both instances, the need there is to record and understand how the project has evolved over time. And this is reflected by the need for maintaining documentation of those changes. So the prioritized requirements list needs to evolve, but through version control, that needs to be recorded as part of the process. Agile also brings a greater degree of collaboration, and particularly when we're dealing with things like the development of software, that can confuse who owns the intellectual property between the parties. The reality in most instances are that when you are developing software these days, you are pulling together proprietary materials owned by third parties, and there's a relatively limited degree of new intellectual property that is developed. But to the extent that that is developed, one of the approaches that is often used is a concept of joint IPR ownership. But that in itself is problematic because of the way the legal rules relating to joint ownership operate. And in that instance, it's much better that the parties decide between them which is the best suited to own the intellectual property and agree that through the contractual mechanism. But because of the collaborative nature of the process, if you don't set that out in advance, the likelihood is that you are going to demonstrate, or sorry, not demonstrate, that there will be confusion as to who owns a particular piece of intellectual property because of the joint contribution to its development. That also reflects a little bit in the allocation of duties and responsibilities. So every Agile methodology has its own nomenclature of who does what and the names for those particular roles. And they can be flexible in themselves, but the contract as a result should recognize that changing landscape and be able to follow the changes through the life cycle of the contract. As we know, one of the key concepts of Agile is that you should have regular delivery of iterative steps. And a consequence of that is that you do need to go through a process of accepting those individual iterations as they come through. Now, from a contractual perspective, what typically happens is once an iteration has been accepted, then the parties, certainly the supplier, tends to assume that there can be no change on that. And with Agile, that does actually operate quite comfortably because the acceptance criteria tend to work in step with the development of each iteration. So provided that the iteration has developed or delivered what the party set out at the start of that iteration, then it should be perfectly possible to accept that without having to worry about some subsequent failure of that deliverable to meet its needs. The likelihood is, though, that the needs will change or may change over time, and an iteration that was perfectly acceptable when it was delivered is actually delivering functionality that is no longer required. Now, that is not a case of the iteration has failed, hasn't failed its acceptance criteria. It is just that the project has moved beyond the level of functionality that was delivered by that iteration, and it can move on as a result. I'm conscious now that I'm starting to go over time. So I've talked a little bit about commercial models and controlling the cost. The commercial models that are available are infinite, and it's really only a case of matching the commercial model to the nature of the development and the processes that have been taken by the parties to achieve a commercial model that matches the delivery that's being required by the project. Shannon, I'm going to stop there and wait for questions at the end, and I shall now hand back to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I have a correction there. Stuart's actually joining us from York. It is our next panelist, our next speaker, Alan Kelly, principal at Alan Kelly Associates. He is joining us from London, and he's going to follow on with Agile Contracts, a template.
Thank you, thank you. Just bear with me a moment as I get my, I'm trying to use two screens here, which is great, except for this. No. Aha, you can all see me.
You got it.
It's nice to hear some of Stuart's words there about scope. It fits right in. It would have been a disaster if he said something different. And it was nice to hear some of Dean's words fit in really well with what I'm going to say here. Apologies if that means it's not quite as new and original as we were hoping for. I'm going to try and give you a template here on how you can go about structuring your contracts. This comes from experience working with some clients, one client in particular, and talking to a number of companies that do this. You might have come across me before in this context. A few years ago, I wrote a piece called Dear Customer, the truth about IT projects. You can download this for free on the Agile Connection website. It's a tongue-in-cheek look at how the IT industry structures its projects, its contracts, and what we actually do, and why we always seem to end up a bit of a winner and our clients don't. It's there in Agile Connection. It's also the prologue for one of my books, Zanpan. Please go and buy the book. If you subscribe to my newsletter list on my website, you can get the ebook for free. But that's just an aside, really. I want to start by making a couple of hypotheses. Because I find that when we get into this conversation about Agile and Agile contracts specifically, people say, well, that's all very good, except in the real world, clients want to award work on a fixed cost, fixed time, fixed feature basis. I mean, this is the housing model, isn't it? Tell me how big the house is going to be, how long it'll take to build, how many bathrooms it's got, and tell me how much it will cost. And as a result of that, most suppliers feel as if they have to bid on this basis, because most customers want to fix everything. They have to bid, and that's the real world, isn't it? So, you know, Stuart and Dean and I can talk about this stuff, but the real world. But let me also point out, some companies, and I suggest most of you who've joined this webinar, see, like I said in the Dear Customer letter, there's problems to this. This doesn't always work. And some people and some companies are looking for something different. I also think there's another group of companies for whom this idea of fix, fix, fix looks decidedly odd. You know, why would you try and fix everything? The what you're going to get, the how long it'll take, the cost. I mean, we're professionals. And what other profession fixes this? Do you go to a lawyer and say, Mr. Lawyer, I am being accused of murder. How long will it take to get me off this charge? Which witnesses will you call? What will the total cost be? On what day will I go free? For heaven's sake, here in the UK, you can't even specify that when you're buying a house. A few years ago, I tried to involve a lawyer to conveyance my house on a fixed fee, fixed contract. It got into such a mess, I had to hire a second lawyer to unpick the problems. Law doesn't operate like this. And when you go to your doctor, I'm sorry, Americans, I live in the socialized medicine world here, but you know, when you go to your doctor, do you say to your doctor, I've got this rash. How long will it take to fix this? How much will it cure? What drugs? You don't say these things up front. With other professions, you go there and it's an ongoing discussion. They try something, they see what happens. Maybe it cures, maybe it gets you off the charge. If not, you try something else, you have some more tests, and you iterate and you decide as you go along. So yes, the real world wants everything fixed, but I'm not sure that means it's the only way of working. And I have an observation. The companies I know who are working in an agile fashion, the companies I know who are bidding on and offering to work in an agile usually means scopeless fashion, are finding that their work is booming. They are getting more work. There are not many companies that do this, but the ones that do it have got more work than they can do, and they can charge top dollar. And I have another hypothesis for you. I'd like to suggest that companies that can work to an agile contract, and an agile contract is largely a scopeless contract, as Stuart was just saying, you can fix the overall objective, build me a CRM system, but you can't fix the details. And companies that will bid and will offer to work on an agile scopeless contract are the better companies. The companies which are not so good, the companies that are not so sure of their skills, the companies that are more worried about their ability to get the next deal, they are the ones who will want to lock you as a client into a fix, fix, fix. So I said I was going to draw on some experience here, and specifically, I'm modeling some of this presentation on some work I did in Bristol with a company called Zone Digital. They are a digital agency, and they are working on a large project for a construction company. And initially, the construction company said, we want to lift and shift something we've already got. So they wanted to start quick. So they engaged quickly, they got going, and they decided to defer the contract details until a later date, 2 or 3 months down the line. So they got the team up and running, assembled the team. I went in, I gave some training to both sides, the suppliers and the clients. And they started working together on an iteration basis. They started to get things that could be delivered. They started to do regular demos. And you know what? 3 months later, the construction company turned around and awarded them a £1 million contract with no scope. There's an objective to this contract, but the team will work out the details. What will be built, the features, the stories, the product items, that's going to be worked out by the team, which is a joint team of Zone and their client. So I'm trying to compile this into a template for you. And so there's two parts to this template. One is the contract. But I don't think you can have an agile contract if you don't couple it with an execution model that matches that contract. I think if you if you have an agile contract and you can't execute on it, if you can't structure the way you're working to match the contract, then you're going to have problems. So as an overarching principle in the contract, it's a risk-sharing contract. In a traditional contract, one side tends to absorb the risk, and that's usually the supplier. The supplier nominally takes all the risk on, and that may mean they pad prices, that might mean they pad schedules. It's not good if the supplier takes on all the risk, because then the client can push back and say, hey, not my problem, you sort it out, which means the client is less incentivized to work with the supplier. Conversely, if the client takes on all the risk, then what incentive has the supplier got to work better, smarter, more reliably? So it's going to be risk sharing. As I just said, and as Stuart was saying, we set an overarching objective. There is a final goal: build a CRM system, increase our sales, more eyeballs on the website. But, and this might be a little different to the way Stuart was talking about, this is a contract for services, not a contract for scope. This is not a contract that's going to deliver you 50 product backlog items. This is a contract which is going to deliver you development services, that is going to help you build something. And it's a contract that will, within the contract, you will discover what needs building, you'll deliver it, and you will flex accordingly. And so the contract is hiring a supplier who is also skilled at helping you, the client, understand what you need and what will deliver value, what will deliver benefit. Now, you can fix the time and you can fix the cost. That, by implication, means you're going to fix the capacity, the number of people who are working on this. I'd also say you want an easy exit contract, or if you want to structure as just a rolling contract, that's fine either way. And yes, both sides want some commitment, as Dean was saying, but it should also be easy for both sides to walk away if things are not working. Again, that incentivizes both sides for it to work well. It also incentivizes you to deliver value. When the value isn't there any longer, perhaps because you've delivered it all, you can walk away from it. In truth, you could always exit a contract. It just doesn't matter how many no exit locking clauses you've got. It was really a question of how much you pay the lawyers and how much of a penalty charge you pay to exit. So we want an easy exit contract, or a contract which has a rolling, maybe 2-month period. That's the contract template. To execute on that, start small and grow. You start with a small team, a small piece of work, a small period of time, a small amount of money. As with so many things in software development, the key is to get good at small. So you start small, and if it goes well, you can grow it. You have a combined team. And when I say combined team, I'm thinking combined in 2 ways. You have combined client people and supplier people. So you've got people from the client and people from the supplier working together as one team. It's also combined in that you have a discovery people and you have delivery people. So discovery people, business analysts, product managers, representatives from the client. Most of the delivery people probably come from the supplier side. Some may come from the supplier, from the client, but this is a combined team. This approach of having all sides represented, business people and technology people, I call BizTech. And I think that we're going to see more of that in future. The other thing which is going to be a bit strange to some of you is you need to keep quality high. And the reason you keep quality high is so you can use that easy exit clause. If you have low quality, the problem is you then get sunk costs and it becomes difficult to exit because the amount of money you need to write off is high. And you can test this because the team are going to be releasing early, releasing often. And when I say release early, I'd like to see them release at the end of the first sprint after 2 weeks. And I'd like to see them release every 2 weeks, if not more often. And if a team can't release early and can't release often, then I have questions over their quality. This also means you need a regular governance procedure. You need a regular governance review. And because if you're going to exercise that exit clause, you need to have the management systems in place to do that. You need to be thinking about this. So regular governance reviews where you're looking at what has been delivered, Has it delivered what you've expected? If not, what can you change? And as Dean was saying, we've got our famous iron triangle here. So in iron triangle terms, the scope, we have a goal. The team are there to find out, discover what needs doing, and decide what the highest value items is. The scope is very, very flexible. As long as we're building towards the goal, it's flexible. Schedule, you can fix schedule. And I encourage you to fix the schedule strategically. How long can we spend on this? How long have we got? When does this need to be in the market? When are our competitors working? And you can fix the cost strategically. How much can we afford to spend on this? How much can we afford to lose? You set the schedule and the cost strategically. Quality, as I said, we need high quality. You always keep quality high. That allows you to have an easy exit. That sets the goal, you trust the team, that's your context. Cost, once you know your cost, in our industry, cost is people multiplied by time, overwhelmingly. There's some fudge factor. But cost is people multiplied by the time you have them for, which means people is cost divided by time. We decide strategically how much we can spend, and we can start small. We can do a small piece of work. We can spend $250,000, and if it works out, we can spend a whole million and then 2 million and however much. And we decide how long we've got for this. And that dictates how many people you have. I like to talk about minimally viable teams. Start with a small, tiny team, grow it as you need to. As I said, fix the spend strategically. How much is it worth? How much can you afford? Let the team work within those constraints. Start small, let the big money follow. I'm going to have to skip these 2 slides because of time constraints here. Just re-emphasizing, we have low quality, we get locked in. There's my contact details. There's some of my books. And there's the Dear Customer letter. I think we've got one more speaker and then we're on to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, very much. And we're going to move to our 5th speaker joining us from Ottawa. We have Larry Cooper. He is the co-founder of Adaptive.org, and the name of his talk is It's Never Just an IT Project. So, Larry, you're up.
Okay, there we go.
Right.
Okay, so I need to share, and here, and right here. You good?
We're actually only seeing half of your screen, it would appear, half of the slide, it would appear.
Only seeing half? Oh,
yes.
Dear. Huh.
I can attempt to run it from here if you prefer, and we can see it.
Whoops. Hang on. Dear.
Or you can try it one more time, see if it'll. There you go. Yep, that works.
Okay. All right. Not sure what went on there. Okay. Sorry.
All right.
Okay. So happy to be here. So what I'm going to talk about is, and the slide title is Procure and Implement Up. And a lot of IT projects start off that way, with the notion of we have to procure and implement something, especially ones that involve COTS software, commercial off the shelf. And it rarely ever ends up as just being an IT project. There's a lot more components to it. Although starting out, they tend to focus on the technology, they tend to focus on their methods and approaches, and there's very little given to the notion of business value, despite the fact that organizations exist to create value. So what I'll do, there's a reference to the case study. This is based on a case study for a client that I had a number of years ago. So although it was a number of years ago, I think a lot of the stories are still relevant and valid. And actually some of the things that we've heard already touch on quite a few of the things that I'm going to reference as well. So the context is that it was a Crown Corporation here in Ottawa. They're sort of a mid-size, about 1,200 employees. A lot of their employees were getting transferred to embassies around the world. They used to do all their training in-house. and all their training content was focused on their own products and services. So the context of the project in this case was to procure and implement a learning management system. So they hired me to lead both the technology and the business side of the project. And why that proved to be a good thing was because I could start to soften the focus on the technology and the methods and approaches and start focusing a lot more on the business value side of it. Although that wasn't necessarily an easy thing to have accomplished. So Stuart mentioned about why lawyers are conservative and they like to use things that already exist, that have been proven and so on. And this was no different. So about 3 years prior, another Crown Corp had gone out to purchase a learning management system. They already had a 246-page RFP that they had in front of them that this Corp had used. But the issue was it was down to things like, and this is where it gets into specifying the nitty-gritty of things like must be able to log on. Now, while this started 3 years prior, the contract had been awarded 18 months prior to my arrival with this Crown Corp, and they'd still not implemented when we started. So here was the issue. We only had 18 months. We only had $2.5 million, and $1 million was actually allocated to the procurement of the learning management system itself. So to Alan's point, fixed scope, fixed cost, fixed time, or so they thought. So day 3, they said, we're doing Agile and specifically Scrum, so they got us all in the room and they taught us how to do Scrum. So that meant we had to use Scrum to do the procurement. The trouble was, this was like 2009, 2010. So as far as we knew, this had never been done before. So, we went to see the Scrum coaches they had on site, which had given us the one-day intro and said, hey guys, what do we do? And they go, well, yeah, we don't do chocolate. The Scrum is only for software development, and they really didn't see how it would apply to procurement. So that was a bit of an issue. So then we had a few more plot twists. The enterprise architecture side of things, technology standards, so how did they come up with the $1 million price tag? Well, they had a preferred vendor in mind. They also looked at industry trends and things like that. So all the usual things that before you even get started, start to constrain what you can do and how you're going to do it. So the typical procurement story is that they look at all these things and they look at their existing system, they look at this RFP that's already out there, they look at the product that they really want, and they come up with an RFP because after all, there is only one right choice that they're going to make, and off they go to implement. Now, the trouble with this is that what we end up with is the solution, which they've now defined, is the definition of the problem. So, can we avoid that same old story? So what if we design the business problem by asking the right questions? So there's something called the hierarchy of powerful questions, and goes from the least to the most powerful here. And obviously the most powerful question is why, is because it's an open-ended question. So things like, well, why does it matter to our customers or client? Why does it matter to the org? Why does it matter to me? And so on. So maybe the main characters can write the story. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little analogy from where I'm from. So up here, hockey is big. And so for a lot of parents, getting up at 6 a.m. or being at the rink rather at 6 a.m. in the dead of winter, so our kids can learn to play hockey. So why do we do this? Well, along the way, we start doing, taking them to additional things to learn different skills like power skating, stick handling, backward skating, and so on. And sort of the epitome for an individual player who makes it all to the professional level in the NHL is to get an interview on Hockey Night in Canada on a Saturday night and get the Hockey Night in Canada towel around their neck. There's actually a bit of a thing about that with the pro players. But the real why is because they want to win a Stanley Cup. So believe it or not, all the way back into initiation hockey when they're 5 and 6 years old, this is the thought process that they have. So all this other stuff they do along the way is because they have an ultimate goal in mind, which is to get to the pro level and win a Stanley Cup. So to every story, there's a moral. And when we have a higher purpose, it gets a lot easier to make better choices. And when we bring it back to sort of procurement and running our projects, we make better choices in what, how, when, and where. And so which way do we go in our story? Well, you start with saying, well, why do you need an LMS? So as I mentioned, it was a geographically dispersed organization. They couldn't bring people in and so on. Well, does that mean your existing training content can be put online as is? Well, no, we have to redesign it. So how do you do that? When, well, we'll probably need new tools. Well, why do you think you need new tools? Because online delivery requires more different content and so on. And so on the questions go. So the more questions you ask, it sort of leads to more questions. And as you kind of read through these, and the slides will be provided later, you start to realize that a new story was emerging. And it wasn't about procuring and implementing an LMS anymore. And the other thing that became obvious was that most projects really are a portfolio masquerading as a project. So if a new story is emerging, then why do we assume our existing old story enables processes, roles, new story enablers rather, like processes, roles, org structures, and so on, will remain the same after we write the new one? And this is the part that's often forgotten. So when they say we're going to go off and procure and implement something, with the focus on the technology and not focusing on, why are we doing this, then we don't get into these nuances of, well, does everything we currently do and how we do it stay the same as well? And a lot of time there's a lot of assumption that that's actually true. So how do we go about structuring a story? Well, so how I did it is I introduced them to the concepts of outcomes management. And really what an outcome is why we want a certain scope. So let's use this simple example here of we want a sustainable and resilient garden. So, would improved access to gardening tools help us achieve that outcome? Yes, it probably would. So what scope? Well, we could start defining product features about how we could have improved access to gardening tools. And maybe we could end up with something like this if the features we want are easy to maneuver over varying terrain, having a seat, tools easy to access while sitting or standing, and so on. Now, is that the only way we can get sustainable and a resilient garden? Well, what would improved irrigation also contribute to that? Probably true. What about sustainable organic fertilization? Probably true. Would we get a better outcome if we had all three? Probably. Would we get a portion of the outcome if we only had one? Yes. And so therein lies part of the issue, is that when we don't know what we're trying to achieve, what outcome we're trying to get to, then in the traditional approaches, we jump straight to scope and we start trying to nail down the features of what we're going to have. And we miss out on these other opportunities. And in some cases, this could lead us to make very different choices. Maybe we can't afford to build that cart. Maybe improved irrigation and sustainable organic fertilization is all we can afford. And this is what uncovers those possibilities. So even when you look at a single outcome that precedes the ultimate outcome, you have lots of possible scopes. So how could you get improved irrigation? Here are some examples. So scopes can be different based on how we approach it. And even within a given how, there is variance in the amount of scope we actually have to satisfy. And I believe it was Stuart mentioned that earlier about being able to stop the contract or the work when enough value has been delivered. So this is kind of how you get to doing that. So it means we have a richer set of choices because there are many possible right answers to satisfy a given outcome. And that's the part that we really need to try and uncover. So let's go back to building our plot around the story. So what this little diagram here is like a typical process model, and also how we look at projects is, we're trying to get some output, the what, there's activity around it, and input. Now, I call this, well, not I call this is the typical work breakdown structure, but I call this the PM's delusion. And most traditional project managers tend to focus on this. Most contracts tend to focus on this. And that's really a bit of a delusion because outcomes will happen whether you plan for them or not. And the issue is, if we don't talk about the good and intended, the ones we actually intend, then we're never going to get them, which means all we can get are these, which means all we ever get from an outcomes perspective in most cases is the surprise. We get the good and intended stuff, unintended rather, and the bad and unintended. And you know, why we want to talk about the good and intended stuff is that it helps us define why and the results we hope to get. There's a fourth one that I came up with a while ago, which was related to the issue of cybersecurity. So this is where the bad guys have their intent. So these are all different outcome types that can be talked about, can be described, and we can work backwards to find out what do those mean. So what output we need to achieve what outcome. So rather than, so the arrow actually goes the other way. So how do we craft the story? So we started with getting different people from around the organization and getting together in different meetings and so on, and talking about why they were doing what they were doing. And we came up with an outcomes map. And as you can see, outcomes maps can be kind of messy and so on when they're being built, and you can have some things that aren't connected yet, but we kind of know we need to do it. We also used a variant of the business model canvas, if you're familiar with that. And what we did there was to focus on the services that the learning and development group provided to the rest of the organization. So that's what that kind of filled in. So then we displayed those things in a public area, and we kept iterating around them. And we put a table with stickies and pens and so on. So as people walk by, they could actually kind of make notes and things like this. Because one of the things we started to find was when people were in these meetings, you know, what we talked about there, it would be a day or two later where they'd come back through emails and things like this and kind of say, hey, I thought about this and I forgot to tell you that. So this kind of helped us with that little issue. But it also, it sort of leads to serendipity, because as people are walking by and standing there and doing things and looking at this, other people walk by and they have conversations. So it's a very visual thing. So that's a useful thing. There's different audiences for the kinds of things you come up with. So we try to sort of use different ways of describing the same thing. So this is kind of a Cole's Notes version of what we came up with. Another one, which is this one's kind of looking at it from a business capabilities perspective, and then value streams as to how you actually deliver on those capabilities. So the boxes are initiatives, the circles are outcomes, the light green ones are the ultimate ones, the darker green ones are the intermediate ones. You also have to know who your story is for. So, and this kind of gets into, there's multiple different players involved in what you're doing. And this was one of the things that we found, was that once we got into it, we realized that, for example, there was a talent management component that wasn't being considered. So there were different parts of even the HR organization that had interest and different perspectives on this. Based on the services side of it, of what we came up with, they were able to come up with a services catalog. So that means the services they provided to the business previously were not the same ones that they needed to provide now. So that was a big change. So what went into the LMS RFP? How did we decide that? So what we did is we looked at the capabilities that an LMS would provide, and within each of the capability areas, we had them come up with capability statements, and then we had them assign a business level of business value. And these are the numbers we used. And then we got them to look at within each of the capability areas and saying, well, if you only had $1 and you had two capabilities that were ranked as a 5, which one would you buy? And in some cases they go, well, they're both the same. So we'd say, okay, they stay as a 5. In other cases say, well, this one's more important than that one. So we'd make it a 4, and we'd keep iterating until we got everything done and there was, we got through it all. So then we kind of said, you know, the things that you say are very low or low business importance, do you really want to put that into the RFP? And that's kind of how the organization ended up with the 246-page RFP, because they had a lot of very low and low importance things. So we decided to take that out. So the RFP went out with only the very high, and medium capabilities. So it's really only the stuff that had real business value. within the RFP itself, we asked the vendors to rank their products against the capabilities. So that, again, it was very simple, kind of black and white. Is, does your product do it out of the box? Is it standard tailoring with no code rewrite or programming, configuration with a partner, and so on. So we had them kind of tell us, and there was no written response. It was all electronic. So the high-level procurement process, 11 vendors invited, 8 expressed interest. 3 vendors responded. We did a 10-page RFP. This was the evaluation workflow, so that's really all the RFP document described. The process, we got everybody together and validated the vendor self-assessment, or the individual team members rather, spent a day doing the vendor self-assessments and looking at that, coming up with their version of it. Then we got everybody together to get a team consensus on the self-ratings. 2 of the 3 vendors that responded passed. We had them do a boardroom demo, and in the demo, vendors 1 and 2 switched places, and days 4 and 5 were paperwork. One of the things we also considered, and Alan sort of alluded to that, is we considered whether or not the vendor could work in an agile way, which is what we wanted to do. So going back to the other parts of the story, the architecture group kind of reappeared at the end and says, well, are you following our standards? Will this vendor meet our architecture? And this ended up causing a 2-month delay until we got into a meeting on a Wednesday afternoon, and we asked the question, what were your architecture and IT standards 10 years ago? Were they the same as they are today? And they said, no. We said, well, 5 years from now, will they be the same? We go, probably not. You go, well, what makes you think today is one of those pivot points? So here was the issue. Well, actually, we had also the issue of the process police. And if you read the case study, you'll find out what I meant by that. So one of the things that we discovered, some of the things that we discovered is when the L&D business unit had a new hire purpose, so they could, coalesce around their why, that's where we uncovered the new services and a new engagement model with the business. All the process stuff had changed, and all that led to a new org structure afterwards. And the other interesting part is that the LMS actually wasn't the only tool that they had to procure. So we had to do multiple procurements. And so really, it's not about IT, and it's also never just about procurement either. So this is what
Larry, I sincerely apologize, but just so we can get to our final speaker, we're going to have to ask you to wrap up in just a few seconds.
Okay, so I'll stop right here. Just the quick little thing. So the issue with the architecture and standards was back to the $1 million on the LMS is that would have caused us to spend the actual $1 million if we had not been able to get past that issue. And instead of spending the $1 million, we ended up spending 2.5% of the original budget for the LMS. So we actually delivered within the original time, the original money, and we also delivered a lot more. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much. And now we have Manjeet Singh. He is based in the Washington, D.C. area, but he is joining us today from India, where it is, I believe, 1 a.m. Or perhaps a bit after. So I know you're all muted, but in solidarity with him, just give him a round of applause as he kicks off our final talk of the webinar, 3 ways to restore government contracts for Agile services. So take it away, Manjeet.
Thank you, Shannon. I have to muster every bit of energy I have to make this interesting. Can you see my screen?
No, we're not seeing it yet.
Now?
Yep, all good.
Okay, excellent. So welcome everybody. I'm going to keep this to the point. Very practical experience based on helping a couple of government agencies here in the United States do better Agile contracts. So I'm going to cover a quick introduction to set the stage, talk about challenges with current contracts that the government uses, and 3 tweaks that can be made to fix these contracts. So many of you may probably not know the statistics, but a lot of government contracts actually do not deliver the scope. And the number is staggering. It's actually 41%. So, and the cost is more than $7 billion. This problem is mainly because traditional government contracts are focused really on, defining requirements up front, a lot of time spent on that, expectation of all the scope to be delivered, and success is measured purely based on whether it was delivered within budget and time. So the typical challenge is because they're using the old waterfall process or mechanism to manage these contracts. And it starts primarily because they spend a huge amount of time in defining all the requirements up front, creating a financial structure which is not supportive and adaptive enough to reflect and react to the learnings and the value that the organization wants to achieve based on the feedback that they're getting from their end users. Very heavy top-down management, governance, which is very bureaucratic, heavy gated procedure, and definitely very document-centric. So the deliverables, majority of them are typically documents, and often you find no mention of the software as a deliverable in the contract. So with these challenges, the statement of work becomes the primary way in which the government operates. They are putting out these elaborate 10, 20, sometimes more than 100 pages of statement of works, very prescriptive, have very little room for being adaptive to the learnings and feedback. Financial structures, fixed price, fairly common, cost reimbursement or cost plus somewhat, and time and material are the typical contracts. The other one is this IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. None of these account for what happens in terms of how do you adapt to actually deliver value and to focus on the higher purpose of predictable pace and a cadence of delivering value. So typical waterfall implementation model, very Microsoft project, schedule-driven, plan-driven. Here's an example of a enterprise performance lifecycle from the FDA. As you can see, there are a lot of gates. It's sequential, it's linear, no feedback, room for inspection and adaptation in terms of ensuring it's moving in the right path to deliver value. And as I mentioned, very heavy focus on output, a lot of work breakdown structure, discussions, baselining. So these are the challenges with the current environment and the current contracts. So what is the solution? There are 3 simple tweaks that I believe we have been able to use effectively to show how this results in a better contract for using Agile methods. The first is to use a statement of outcomes rather than a statement of work. A statement of work focuses on deliverables, which is output, whereas a statement of outcomes is purely focused on identifying what value is expected. Second is to provide a high-level product backlog and a definition of done. So there is a clear upfront expectation of what constitutes getting over the finish line and what it is that the vendor has to deliver over the finish line. And the last is to change the structure around buying a team for a fixed price by identifying a fixed number of sprints or releases. These are the 3 tweaks. And there are 2 other tweaks that can provide a lot of value for government contracts. One relates to having an explicit owner, product owner identified who is empowered, sorely lacking in the government. And the last one is to use very lightweight governance. So over the next few slides, I'm going to talk about these 5 tweaks. So we basically get 2 extra bonus tweaks here to contracts. The first one talks about statement of outcomes. This directly comes from a US government document called the TEC-FAR, Technical Federal Acquisition Regulation. That's what the acronym stands for. And it clearly states that a statement of outcomes only requires these following sections: purpose, scope, period and place of performance, a background about the nature of the work, and clearly define performance objectives along with any operating constraints. That is all that is needed in a statement of outcomes. And this is the excerpt from the official document. As it says, the TEC-FAR approach to requirements is to have a product vision with an explanation how the Agile process will be used to achieve this vision. Very simple, very straightforward, unfortunately not very well known, and also less understood. The benefits of a statement of outcome is purely the scope and vision aligns well with the product vision or a minimum viable product. The performance objectives can be reflected in a healthy product backlog that can be provided by the customer. And any operating constraints here map well to non-functional requirements or having a clearly articulated definition of done. The product backlog, this is where the customer needs to put in some effort to define what is the desired product roadmap, what that would look like in terms of high-level features and functionality. A backlog which is ranked by value. So there is some thought given in terms of the customer stakeholders identifying what would be of value to their end users. Also providing a definition of done that provides a clear list of what constitutes a shippable, potentially shippable product. So any constraints around non-functional requirements are defined before the project begins and is part of the request for the proposal. In terms of the cost, rather than going with the traditional models of fixed price or T&M, here one has to pivot the question, and instead of asking how much it will cost, they ask how much do we invest to achieve value, which means they have to think about, and the stakeholders need to identify how much time and costs needs to be invested to realize the value that they need for their end users. So this is where fixed time and a fixed budget is the best way, because that constraint is a healthy constraint which forces the stakeholders and the product owner representing the government agency or the customer to identify what is the value, rank it by order of highest value, and then achieve it in the constraint of a given number of sprints. So once you set your number of sprints, you identify the size of a scrum team, which you know is pretty well defined, 3 to 9. And then based on a budget, decide how many sprints you need to realize the value of your product backlog. This allows you to now know explicitly upfront the overall duration and the cost for the project. So the example cited here is pure, simple, straightforward math. There is no voodoo magic or other funny math going on here. The fourth tweak surrounds around creating a empowered product owner as part of the contract. A government employee representing the agency, which is the customer, is designated as a product owner, works with the Scrum teams and the stakeholders to determine that the value is being realized, prioritize the backlog, and decide the content of releases. Just the typical expectation one has from a product owner on a Scrum team. And the last tweak here is around governance. I know this is institutionalized in several government agencies around heavy dependence on gate reviews, but that provides a lot of friction in terms of agile delivery, and it slows down any motivation that the team has to deliver value quickly and on a predictable pace. So one has to evolve to use very lightweight governance where only the appropriate amount of inspection is done for the amount of work that has been done by the team, rather than creating these baselines and setting expectations to produce documents like design documents for the entire project, architecture documents, security documents, all up front without developing a single line of code. So to summarize, the 5 tweaks here are purely simple, straightforward: creating a statement of outcomes, providing high-level product backlog with a definition of done, the customer buying teams for a fixed number of sprints, the customer designating an empowered product owner, and the customer adopting a lightweight governance. And all of these are formalized and explicitly articulated in the contract. So this provides both the government and the vendors who are potentially bidding on any work to work off of the same rules of the game and deliver value as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Manjeet, for bringing that to a close. That closes the speaker portion, and we are now going to take some time for questions and answers. We've got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to invite the panelists to rejoin via video. We have a couple of questions here that I will read out, and then please, those of you who would like to, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit other questions. You can also use the hand raise functionality if you'd like me to promote you to a panelist so that you can ask your question. Just please be aware that, that when that happens, your camera may go on automatically depending on what your settings are. So just be prepared for that if you're going to come and join the panelists with a question. So the first one we have is for Mirko. It's, could Mirko expand on how he worked with the legal team, especially in terms of changing their mindset?
Sure. Basically, it was quite easy because at the very first workshop, we just invited them and said, you know, who of you would join us? I mean, you will be just experts. You are not fully delegates for that cross-functional team, but who of you we can contact? And then we just had them in a regular loop. And for example, so they really appreciate this early involvement. Secondly, they got to know from the very beginning why we are doing things, how we like to work together with the suppliers. So the collaboration model was very important to understand for the legal, but also the pricing model. And they were part of that discussion. And so they felt like part of the team. And so the mind shift, it wasn't something within one workshop, no, for sure not. But I think the early involvement was kind of key. Does that answer your question?
Let's see. I'm not seeing anything additional in the chat box. Oh, here we go. Yes, thanks. And then we had a comment, and Stuart addressed some of this during the speaking during the presentations. But there's the first one is, what have your arguments, or what have been your arguments to lawyers to step away from precedent? As a former solicitor here in New Zealand, it seems like something quite radical to ask lawyers to do. And so I wanted to ask you to expand on that for the group.
Sure. So one of the things that I've been doing in the background is trying to develop or promote agile templates so that lawyers have got something to fall back on, essentially to provide them with a precedent that they can go and use. So I've written templates that are published by the likes of Lexis PSL, which is one of the legal publishing houses, and also organisations like the Agile Business Consortium. These are effective, well, the legal publishing houses don't allow you to use the precedents for free, but some of the other sources, I've allowed people to use those templates free of charge. So I'm putting that intellectual property out into the marketplace, complete with guidance notes on how to even use it. So in essence, you don't need to go to a lawyer as a result of that. Unfortunately, that's not how it often works at the end of the day, but that's the intent. So the short answer is by providing people with precedents that they can fall back to, or at least have examples that they can work to.
And then the follow-up to that was, do you know of any cases where Agile contracts have gone awry and gone to court?
Yeah, unfortunately in the UK there have been a couple of cases. Probably the biggest one that people in the UK may be aware of is the B-Sky-B case with, can't think of the name of the supplier now off the top of my head, which was an Agile development that went wrong. EDS, thank you, Alan.
It was a few years ago, wasn't it? 6 or 7 years back.
Correct.
The other one that hasn't gone to court, but in similar lines, is Universal Credit. The thing is, if you speak to people who've worked on many of these projects, you find that while they are agile on the outside and they are billed to everyone as agile, many of the practices that myself and the people on this panel, Dean, and recognise are decidedly unagile. Some of the legacy vendors, and I guess EDS no longer exists, have a habit of dressing up their old offerings in Agile.
I'll just come back to you on that, Alan, actually. I know the lawyer who was involved with doing some of the drafting for Universal Credits, and you're absolutely right. He and I have had long arguments in the past as to how you draft for Agile, and he is, if I'm an advocate for Agile, he is the opposite end of the spectrum, doesn't believe in it at all. And I think what you allude to there is actually one of the other big problems, is that a lot of people throw Agile terminology at a contract and assume that makes it Agile, or potentially worse, it's part Agile and part waterfall sequential type drafting. And that's always going to result in failure. And I think one of the problems with the EDS B-Sky-B contract, and the reason why that failed, is the development teams were using Agile methodologies, but the contract had been drafted for a waterfall approach. And when it came to arguing the obligations between the parties, of course, the contract didn't match up with what was being delivered. And that was one of the reasons why it ended up in court.
Next up, we have a question for Manjeet. Sally is asking, any further guidance on what light governance might look like?
Yes, and Shannon, is it possible for me to share my screen to show what that would look like?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There we go.
So this is an example of where we adopted a enterprise lifecycle, which is heavily gated, and reduced it from close to 96 documents to under 40. That's what the government would tolerate in terms of scaling it down. But the big difference is the documents are not required all up front, except for a couple. Everything else evolves through the sprints. So that's why, as you notice, sprint 1 through sprint n, the documents evolve, and the suffix at the end, the P stands for preliminary, and the F means it's a final version, which doesn't emerge until the end of the last sprint. So that's an example of how we reduced very heavy, very gated process to having no gates at all, except one in the beginning of the sprint and one at the end of the last sprint. So one at the beginning of the first sprint, one at the end of the last sprint, and every other, all the other documents. are incrementally evolving throughout the life cycle as you go through the sprints. Hopefully that addressed your question. Back to you, Shannon.
All right, I just saw a thank you come through from her, so looks like you did. And now we have another one for Mirko. Jorge is asking, Mirko, what was your experience of putting together a group of competing vendors to structure the contract?
Well, that was a bit of strange for them at the very beginning, but then it was very stressful 2 days. So after the first exercise, I mean, it was just usual work. On the other hand, it was quite inspiring for them and motivating to see what the others achieve in a very short amount of time. So it was also kind of competition, especially if we had these public reviews in the evening. They saw what they achieved, how it looked like. Oh, they have a very nice look and feel, so we have to invest more in that on the second day. So it ran quite good. I mean, I have to say, all the critical things like the contract details, the economical numbers, prices, etc., were not shared. Therefore, we had breakout sessions, private breakout sessions. But besides that, everything else was transparent. And that, I think, was a kind of a win-win also for the buyers team, because they could answer questions just once, speak a bit louder, and everybody heard it, for example. Or they could have, we had just one last example. We had a short discussion about you've read the Agile contract. Do you see some major risks we want to talk about all together, for example? And then we talked about that, how to handle, I don't remember what, right? Did that answer your question?
Looks like he said, thank you. It seems quite challenging.
It is, yeah. I mean, we've done that several times in a sequence. So for 4 to 5 hours, we recommend 1 day per supplier. That's much more relaxing, but having all at once is much more fair, because you do not go through the learning curve, you know. You go through the learning curve all together.
And we have what looks like our final question for Stuart and Alan. Does that mean the contract should step away from using Agile specific terms within the contract and rather have language that reflects Agile methods, aka instead of using Scrum, be term specific and say we will work in 2-week iterations, etc.? And it looks like Stuart had started to answer that in the chat. I'll just ask you to elaborate for those watching the video as well.
Sure. So what I was responding by chat was the fact that there's nothing wrong with using Agile terminology. It needs to be properly defined within the contract so that both parties understand what you mean by the use of jargon, or what could be seen as jargon. But the key, I think, is the contract has to reflect the methodology that you're using. And we know there are lots of different Agile methodologies out there. They're all basically the same. In that they have very, very similar features. We talk about the sprints, we talk about retrospectives and collaboration between the parties. The key to having a successful Agile contract is that it must reflect the methodology that you're using. It's got to deal with the obligations of the parties and properly allocate those between them. So the person who is drafting the contract does have to have an understanding of the methodology. Where it goes wrong is where people just use the language of a particular methodology, like sprint, like retrospective, and try and impose those on processes that were designed around a different methodology. In other words, the waterfall sequential methodology. It's where you get that mixing together that creates the problem. I tend to think of contracts being in essentially 3 component parts. You have some operative provisions at the start of the contract that tell you how you're going to do the contract or provide the services or do the development. You have some what lawyers tend to call boilerplate, which are the standard clauses. They deal with simple things like confidentiality, disputes, governance processes that are largely the same, but they do change with Agile, but largely the same as most contracts are. And then you have some schedules that provide you with some very specific details. For example, the requirements, the prioritized requirements list, the solution aspects of it. And those can be much more free-flowing in their terminology and much more aligned to the Agile language that you tend to get to see. It's the front part, it's the operative part, where if people are just throwing the jargon at the operative part, they're going to miss the point of the contract.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And that brings us just about to the end of our program for today. Just on behalf of Business Agility Institute, I want to thank our 6 speakers and also everyone attending from all over the world. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this. And one of the questions that was answered via chat is that the slides and this video will be available on businessagility.institute. And we're not sure of the dates yet, but there are symposia scheduled for June and July as well. June will be on structural agility and July on finance and beyond budgeting. So keep an eye out for information on that. And so I'm being asked how many people attended. We were at about 26 attendees at the max point. So we know this one was a little bit later in the promotion than ideal, but this is a good group and it looks like everyone enjoyed themselves and learned some things. So thank you very much.